Hello guys and welcome again to my channel. So during this time, in this video lecture, we're going to talk about internal controls. Okay, so our topic for tonight is internal controls. So I have here 4 questions that we need to answer so that we'll be able to understand the internal controls. The first one would be, what is this internal controls? The second would be, how do you strengthen the internal controls if you have internal controls already that are weak? The third one would be, what are the components of the internal control system? The fourth would be, what are the limitations of the internal controls? So there are 4 questions. Okay, so let's start with the first question. But before we do that, of course, if you think that my speaking is slow in English because that is not my primary language, you can go to the settings of your YouTube application and choose times 1.25 or times 1.5 or times 1.75 or 2 times if you wanted to. And of course, you can always choose to turn on the closed captions so that you will have some subtitles on what I am saying. Okay? So let's have question number 1. What is this internal controls? What are internal controls? Internal controls are actually, first, the internal controls are actually, how do you call this? These are processes and systems of check and balances. Okay? So that is internal controls, check and balances. So of course, in this first elaboration that I'm going to make, it's as if these internal controls are the answer, is the answer to corruption. So that opposes corruption. Okay? Number 2, it's an illustration so that you will understand internal controls. Now, internal controls are somewhat like, what do you call this? Aside from checks and balances in number 1. In number 2, you have this mission, vision, and goals of a certain organization or organizations, right? So think of it as a destination. Okay? So, how to get there? Of course, you have to travel. For example, we have a car. So, the internal controls in that particular scenario or story is the systems or the processes that ensures that the wheels of the car are working, or else the what do you call this machine, I don't know, the steering wheel is working, the GPS is working. Okay, and other parts that are necessary for the car to go to its destination. Because if the internal control is weak, then the destination might not be reached because of some accidents, or the car will stop, or the car will go to a different destination. So that's number 2. It's an illustration. And if you still don't understand internal control, I have number 3. Number 3 is, um, in an organization, you don't want to have any monkey businesses happening, right? So what you want to do is to strengthen the internal control so that there will be no unrelated businesses that will happen in the entity. That, just think like you are a sole proprietor of a very big and complex corporation or business. Of course, you are not always there as the owner, right? Like for example, you have a very big school, and then you wanted to know if all the teachers are doing their job well. They are delivering education to the students well. Of course, the, what do you call this? The owner cannot be present in each of the teachers' classes, right? So there are internal control activities that will help him to understand if um, the instructors or the professors or the teachers are doing their job well. And that is an internal control activity called the assessment of the students of that particular teacher based on his performance. How do the students rate them? So that's an internal control activity. Okay? So that is internal control. Okay? Now, question 1.5. Why is it necessary? Now, this is actually very much necessary in all of the organizations. Be it business, be it not for profit. It is because, again, it will help you reach the destination, the mission, the vision, the goals of the organization. Okay? So that is what do we call as operational objective of the internal controls. Actually, there are three objectives of the internal control. The first one is the operational objective, which is the internal controls helps the organization reach its mission, vision, and goals. Okay? We have financial reporting objective. It ensures that the reporting is done promptly, the financial reporting is done promptly, and the financial reporting is in compliance with standards, is in compliance with government set requirements, something like that. It is timely for decision making. So that's what we call as financial reporting objective of the internal control. And the third one is the compliance objective. So internal controls also, if you have a good internal control system, it will help the company comply with government agencies and especially government agencies and other standard setting bodies. Okay? So those are the three objectives of internal control. So again, why is it important? Because internal controls fulfills three objectives. Again, the operational objective, which helps the organization go to its destination, its mission, vision, and goals. And the second one, financial reporting objective, which is internal control. Strong internal controls helps the financial reports to be reliable and relevant. Okay? And the third one is the compliance objective, in which the internal controls helps much in uh, following or passing the requirements of the government agencies and others and other standard setters. Okay? Now, why is it important really, aside from those that I've mentioned? So this is very much important in uh, for those people who wanted to design a system. Like for example, an accounting system. So if you wanted to design an accounting system, be sure that when you do the system, for example, payroll system, from step 1, step 2, until salaries are given, until recording of the salaries, that is a system, the payroll system. Uh, if you are going to design that particular system, payroll system, and other systems of the accounting system, be sure that you know the principles of internal control so that you can infuse that in your design. Okay? So that, which is why we're talking about this. If you are going to make or design an accounting information system, this is very important for you. Okay? And if you are also an auditor, so you don't have to be shocked or surprised that the auditors also need a background on strong internal controls. It is because sometimes, and not sometimes, most of the times, the auditors, especially the financial statement auditors, will test if the internal controls of a certain entity that they are auditing is strong or weak, especially if it has a connection as to the reliability of financial statements. Okay? Not only financial statement auditors, there are also auditors that tests for the operations of the entity, something like that. Of course, they have to have a knowledge about the internal controls by heart so that they will be able to test if the operations are effective and efficient and there are no corruptions and there are no monkey businesses. Okay? And if there are, of course, that's minimal or not rampant or not, what do you call that? Not that material. Okay? So, again, internal controls are important for designers of accounting information system and auditors. Okay? Now, next question. Question number 2. How to strengthen internal control? Wait. So you can strengthen how to strengthen internal control. First, you have to strengthen its components. So let's talk about the components of internal control one by one. Okay? So what are the components of the internal control? The most important uh, element, element, components or element of internal control is the control environment. Because this control environment, if we are going to express it simply, these are the people in the organization. Okay? So if these are the people, sometimes even if you have already designed a very sophisticated system, like step 1, it should be like this, step 2, it should be like this, step 3, step 4, step 5. However, the people has no integrity at all. They are in teamwork in making corruptions. So if that will be the case, even if your control system is designed to be very complicated or complex and very strong, supposedly, if the people are dishonest, then it will fall. That is why this is the most important element of the internal control, which is hiring the right people and putting them in the right jobs. Okay? So, if we are to, what do you call this? Emphasize or discuss more on people, we're talking about three groups. The first one would be the top management. The second would be the supervisors or middle management. And the employees. Okay? So first, when we talk about employees, if you wanted to strengthen your internal control, employees, in hiring process, you should be strict already. So you could put there some requirements in order to hire really people with good, what do you call this, ethical values. Like for example, you need people you posted as a requirement who are cleared on the NBI clearance and the police clearance, and you are also going to investigate such persons that are applying, and you are calling also their previous employer, something like that, to ensure that your employees are competent and has integrity. Competent and has integrity. Okay? And sometimes in the competence side, you have to test them. You have to give EQ tests, IQ tests. You are also going to give them interviews, and then panel interviews, like how many different stages of interviews, just to ensure that the employees are good, competent, and has integrity. Okay? So that's one way of strengthening your internal control, which is the hiring of the right employees. Okay? Now, as to the middle management and the top management, and we have the board of directors or those charged with governance, you have to make sure that these are also competent and with integrity, as well as they are also active. Because sometimes, even if a person, especially if they are already at the top, the board of directors and the top management, they have already uh, proven their competence and their integrity. That's why they're there. Sometimes, if they are not active, then the internal control system will fall still. Because if ever these people at the top, the board of directors or those charged with governance, the top management and the middle management does not or are not active enough in order to implement the internal control system with the employees, then the employees will make some monkey businesses, as I've mentioned, which are not related already to the mission, vision, and goals of the organization. Okay? So they should be active. Okay? And of course, I will emphasize, they should have integrity. They should not use the organization in order for personal gain. Okay? So that's how you strengthen your internal control. You have to be very careful in hiring employees, and you make sure that you put the right people in the top management and the board of directors and even in the middle management. Okay? Now, let's go to the next one. We have the information and communication system. Okay? So we have, if ever you wanted to strengthen your internal control, see to it that your information and communication system is working. So maybe if ever there are memos or if there are things that you need to discuss within your organization, be sure that your information and communication system is fast and efficient. Okay? Because if ever there are problems and you have a slow information and communication system, then the internal control will crumble. Okay? You follow? So, next is we have risk assessment procedures. Although, so risk assessment procedures, if your company is not doing that, like you're only going with the flow, then you have a weak risk assessment procedures. Because if ever you have a good internal control, you should have established these risk assessment procedures. Okay, so meaning you are always thinking proactively that there might be some problems in the future and you have to solve it now. Okay? For example, if you have foreseen problems like the pandemic, something like that, if ever you have a strong internal control and you have a group that foresees problems before it happens, then you have a good risk assessment program. Okay? So you have to have this. Actually, in the risk assessment, the basic of this is that um, if there are problems, you assess them and their effects to the stakeholders if there are problems that might happen. Okay? And also, aside from which, if you are going to make some decisions, before you implement the decisions, you have to consult again what will be the negative or positive effects on all the stakeholders. Like for example, if you are a company or a school, for example, and you are for profit as a school, you have to think of what will be the effect on the parents, what will be the effect on the students, what will be the effect on the employees, what will be the effect on the government entity that you are reporting to, something like that, before you do a decision or you make a decision. It's not only being proactive, it's also assessing first your decision if ever you're going to implement it. Okay? So, one of the ways to strengthen the internal control is intensify your risk assessment procedures. Okay? Now, we have also control activities. So, this is the ones that's most relatable. So, on the control activities, you have here the most important thing. We have physical controls. First, it's not the most important thing. Let's talk about first the physical controls. So the physical controls are those vault, for example, for cash. That's a physical control. The purchase of vault, the usage of vault, if ever we're talking about uh, storage keeping of cash. So that's a physical control. Or else, aside from the vault, we have security systems or CCTVs. Those are physical controls. Or else, if you have a very confidential information, those information are stuck elsewhere in the company. So, meaning it is less accessible by everybody. Only specific persons can access it. That's a physical control. Okay? So, next is we have information controls. So, what are these information controls? So, I'd have to get back to you on this later on in this particular video still, information controls, I just have to finish everything yet. But the summary of the information controls is, um, if ever you have a computer system, or yeah, you're using already the latest technology, the system, you have to ensure that the input is correct, and then the processing is there. The processing is also correct, and the output is very much reasonable with the input. Okay? So those are what do we call as application controls. So application controls basically has input, processing, and output controls. Okay? And we have general controls. Think of these general controls as controls for the making or and maintaining a whole system, a general system, okay, an operating system, okay. So the application controls are just for application systems. Like for example, if we're talking about management information system as a whole, so meaning that is a computer system that caters already different departments, like the admin, like the top management, like the accounting, everything is covered in that management information system. In order to make that whole management information system in the point of view of designing a new system for the company, that whole system, you have to introduce general controls. Okay? Now, how about these application controls? That's talking about each application on the whole system. Like for example, management information system is the general system. So there are applications there, like for example, inventory system, payroll system, which is just part and parcel of what is the general system. Okay? So in the payroll system, for example, you have to introduce this input, processing, and output controls. On the general controls, there are also specifics here. But then again, I will get back to you on that so that we will be able to finish everything. So basically, the information controls ensures that the input has been processed correctly. Okay? Now, we have the other one. We have physical controls, information controls, and the assessment and evaluation. Something like that. So, the same with what I've said earlier as the example of the owner of a certain school, and he or she wants to know if ever the teachers are teaching well, are delivering instruction well, are following the mandate of the government entity that the university or the school is under, something like that. You can have the assessment and evaluation of the students even if you are not present in the classes of all of your teachers as the owner. Okay? So we have assessment and evaluation. And we have the most important thing that you should remember always, the segregation of duties. Assessment and evaluation is also called performance reviews. But then again, if we're talking about performance reviews, it's not only limited to people. Okay? You can also make performance reviews of equipments and machineries and systems, if ever. Okay? That's why my acronym for this control activities is PIPS, physical controls, information controls, performance reviews, and segregation of duties. Now, let's go back to segregation of duties. So, even if the company is very small, okay, and it has only small personnel, the organizational chart is very simple because the owner is saving money for salaries. Even if you are the owner who wants to save money from salaries. You have to put these duties into separate persons. So you can merge everything. You can have a certain employee who handles multiple tasks. But when it comes to these duties that I'm going to tell you, it should be placed in different persons. Otherwise, there will be corruption. There will be some problems for the entity. There will be as worst as possible, theft and etc. Fraud. Okay, so you have to follow the segregation of duties. So, for example, no. For example, let me enumerate what are these duties first. The first one is the approval function. So you can have an employee who approves a lot of transactions. It's fine, so long as he is confined to approving only or authorization of transactions. Okay? Also, the approval function, aside from which there are three actually. The second one is custodian. So, if there is a person who has a custody of cash, custody of assets, custody of petty cash, custody of this, custody of that. So, property custodian, for example, should only be a custodian. It could not have an approval function or authorization function. That is what is meant by segregation of duties. Okay? So, a person or an employee, if he has custody of cash, for example, he can have custody of cash, custody of inventories, custody of everything. You can assign him everything, but it's only related to custodianship. Okay? And the last is recording function. If you are saving for salaries, you can ask a single employee to record a lot of things, like record the payroll, record the inventories, record the system, record the petty cash, so long as it's related only to recording function. Okay? So these particular duties should not be merged, because if it is merged, like for example, imagine a certain employee who has a recording function and custodianship function and approval function. Of course, for example, a company will purchase something. And of course, since I am the approver, of course, I will approve such transaction. And then I'm also the custodian of those items that were ordered, those items that were purchased. So there is already a certain kind of hint, right? That there is a risk that it will result to fraud or something bad, right? So, aside from you are the custodian, you are also the ones who will record. Of course, you can choose not to record anything that is in your custody, right? So there will be no checks and balances. Like for example, as a custodian, you have the responsibility to take care of things that is that is entrusted to you as the custodian. What if I don't record? Okay? So meaning my responsibility will not be there anymore. Right? So again, you have to always think that if you are to assign a system and you are to assign duties and responsibilities to your employees or to your co-employees if you're the top manager, supposedly these duties should be segregated and not to be merged into one person. Okay? So those are the components or the elements of the internal control that you have to strengthen in order to answer this. How to strengthen internal control. Do you follow? Now, before we get back to this information controls, let's talk about that information controls. Let's erase the writings, some of the writings in the board, but I don't know where the eraser is. So, okay, before we go back to this, I will erase this in a little while. let's talk about the limitations of internal control. Okay? So the limitations of the internal control, it cannot be perfect unless otherwise you own a single business and you are the owner. You have perfect internal control if that's the case. Because you are the employee, you are the boss, and you are the ones handling all the transactions. So there will be no corruption, there will be no fraud, because you cannot be dishonest with yourself, right? But in a bigger company or organization context, the internal control system will not be perfect or 100% effective. Why? It's because it has its limitations. The first one is the cost benefit. Sometimes the cost of introducing something to strengthen the internal control is greater than the benefit. So if that would be the case, you will not push through that internal control change, right? So for example, you put some CCTV outside the gate or inside the comfort room. What will you get if ever you're going to put some CCTVs in the urinals? Right? The benefit is lower than the cost. So you will not implement it. Actually, the cost of that is the cost of the CCTV and the cost of legal lawsuits if ever people will find out that you have CCTVs in the comfort room, right? The point is, there are internal control initiatives that are more costly than the benefit. Okay? The second is uh, collusion among employees. Teamwork, as what I've said, teamwork of the employees in order to defeat the system. So even if your system is already complicated, it's well designed. Your internal control system is well designed. If the employees implementing it are a team in defeating it, okay? So the ones that will check the the work of a certain person will not check anymore because they are friends. That's collusion among employees. Then the control system is still useless. Okay? So that's one of its limitation, collusion among employees. And the third one is internal control is only established in usual transactions. So it's very long. It's up to you to write it down. So internal control is can be designed more effectively in the usual transactions or recurring transactions. But as to unusual transactions, they will not be, sometimes the top management or the designer of the internal control system will not pay attention to those non-recurring transactions or once in a while transactions. So those are the limits of the internal control system. Okay? Now, let me erase this first. I don't know where the eraser is. Let me erase this first and let's go back to organizational controls. Okay? As one of the organizational controls. Let's go back to information controls as one of the components or elements of internal control under control activities. Okay? I'll be right back. So, this is it. Let's go back to the information processing controls. As I've told you, that's under control activities. Actually, again, the elements of the internal control starts with the most important one, control, environment, and then we have information and communication systems, and we have the risk assessment procedures, and then the control activities. And the control activities, we have PIPs, we have physical controls, we have information processing. That's what we're going to talk about now. And we have the performance reviews and the segregation of duties, where the authority or the authorization or approval should be separated with custodian function, and these two should be separated from the recording function. Okay? We have information processing. So in the information processing, you have two. We have the general controls, which is talking about the overall information system if you have, and we have the application controls. So let's start with the general controls first. So the general controls is SODA, SODA, SODAM. Okay, SODAM. So what is S? S stands for Systems Development and Documentation Controls. So what is this? Let's get the point of view of a certain organization who wants to have a system that matches their operation. So what they did is they have made their own system. Okay? So we are going to customize a system that is matching the operations. So what will happen? During the system's development, there should be a proper approval between the user department or the ones that will use the system eventually, the user department and top management. So that's one of the systems development and documentation controls. Okay? So it should be approved properly by the user departments and top management. And aside from which, under the systems development and documentation controls, each stage of development should be documented if possible. The programs that were written should be preserved. It should be documented. Why? Because sometimes, even if the system is finished, later on, you will realize that it does not really fit something and you have to change it. And sometimes there is innovation. So you have to change it. How will you change it if ever, for example, the creators, the programmers, and etc., the programmers and the system analysts who made or created the system is not already there. They resigned. If there is no documentation, you cannot change it, right? And aside from which, if ever there is no documentation at all on the programs, and for example, even if the system developers are still there in the company, but they forgot. It's in my experience already when I worked with a certain company that the system developers forgot how to code because it has been used for many years already and they just maintain the system. If there is no proper documentation, then you cannot change it. You get me? So you should have a proper systems development and documentation controls. Now, let's go to the second one. The second one is the most important general control. Okay? So this talks about organizational controls. So organizational controls talks about people again as to system. So the organizational controls focuses in one main goal, that is to separate the user departments or the ones that will input in the system and the creators or the designers. Normally, the creators are in the CIS department. So if ever the CIS department has made a system, of course, they are not the ones who will use it because they're considered the creators. We have the user departments, like for example, the finance department, the cashiers, those that will ultimately use the system when it is done. Okay? So there is always a problem if ever the creators are also the users. Because if you are the creator and you are the user of the system and you don't like the output of the system, then you can modify the system to suit the output to your liking, right? So it's very risky. So under the organizational controls, the creator, the CIS department should be separated from the user department. Do you understand? Of course, if we expound the organizational controls, there is also separation in the CIS department. Like for example, this is the CIS department, a simple CIS department. We have CIS director, the head, and we have here the creators, which are the programmers and the system analyst. So the system analyst is actually the ones, system analyst and designer. So I have worked like this in my practice wherein I analyze first the current system, the current process, the current transactional cycles, and after which I tend to modify it into a better one that will suit the business or organization to make the operations more efficient and effective. So that is the role of the system analyst and designer. So not necessarily the system analyst and designer will code. The ones that will code is the programmer. Now, in the CIS department, these people, the creators still, should be separated from the uh, computer operators and data entry operators. So, who are these people? When these people, the creators, finish their system, sometimes they give the manual to someone, right? Who will operate the system and solve some minor issues if ever there are issues with the user departments. Like, for example, the cashier has a problem on how to input the data that he wants because the system rejects it. Sometimes the computer operators are the ones who will fix it, the minor. Okay? So the computer operators are the ones who will be given instructional manual by these creators. Okay? So that's how I see it. That's the simplest description of who are the computer operators. Now, let's go to the data entry operators. The data entry operators are the ones that will they act as a first shield. So this user department usually inputs in the system. So before it goes directly to the system, they can be checked by the data entry operators. They will, what they call this, verify if the inputs are correct. So data entry operators. Okay? And sometimes if the CIS department is big, there is another one. We have the librarian, in which the librarian is, of course, they store the documentations of the system, like the programs of the system, the outputs of the system. Sometimes the librarian has the access to those. And if ever there are some information that user departments wants or anybody wants in the organization, they go to the librarian. Okay, like for example, data from 5 years ago, what is the output on January 1, 2000, for example. You go to the librarian because maybe he or she has the access to those old files. Okay? And the librarian can also have the source codes, the source codes or the systems development documentation. Okay? And we have the control group, which are actually from their, what do you call this? From the word control. They are the ones who will supervise, for example, the inputs, the input making. They are verifying the process of putting inputs by the user department and the data entry operators. Of course, they will also supervise as to the process of processing those input and check if there are errors. And of course, aside from checking the processing and the errors, they are also going to check the output if ever they are reasonable. So input versus output if they are reasonable. And they are also the ones who will be in charge in ensuring that the output goes to the right people because there are some confidential information or confidential output that should only go to specific people in the company or entity. Okay? So that's it. So basically, organizational controls just tells you to separate the creators from others, from the user department, the CIS, from the user department, and under the CIS, the programmer and system analyst and designer should be separated from others. Okay? So, what's next? We have SODAM, uh, systems development and documentation controls. We have, let's first have the A. I have forgotten the D. Um, D is all about data recovery controls. So you should have data recovery controls because it will be very detrimental to the company if ever all the data is lost, especially if you are already using the latest technologies. Everything is already in the computer and there is a virus and that virus erased all the files. So that is very much detrimental to the company. So make sure that you have data recovery controls. Like for example, there is a backup of the system. So there are 3 copies of the system, for example. So if ever one is lost, there are still 2. So that's data recovery controls. And we have also, when using magnetic tapes only, I don't know if this is still used, magnetic tapes. You have the grandfather, father, and son technique, wherein if there is a file here, raw material for example, and it will go to process 1, so there is output, right? And then this output, it will go to process 2 again, in the process 2, and it will have another form of output. So it has been filtered by process 1 and process 2. So if this is the final output, you have to keep it. And if this is destroyed, you have to keep the other 2. So the grandfather, you have to keep not only the father but the grandfather. Because if the son is destroyed, you can go to the grandfather and process it again in order to make the son again. Okay? So that's the grandfather, father, and son technique. You follow? So that's it for the data recovery controls. Data recovery. And we have access controls. So we're talking about information processing here. So meaning in access controls, not everybody can access all types of information. So a specific employee can only access specific information only also. So you have to use passwords, something like that, or else biometrics if you wanted to, or iris scanner if you wanted to. So those are access controls. Okay? And we have the last one is monitoring. You have to monitor all the general controls. So, are you keeping a track of the system's development and documentation controls? Are your data recovery techniques still usable? Because maybe there are viruses that will go not only on the son, but it will go also in the father, the grandfather, and the grandest. Okay? So you have to monitor always if these controls, the general controls, are still effective, especially if we're talking about technology because the innovation level nowadays is getting so much faster. Okay? Now, let's go to input controls because again, in the information processing under the control activities, there are 2 general controls and application controls. So, application controls is all about input controls so that your input is correct, processing controls so that the processing is correct, so that you will have output that is correct also. So you have controls here, you have controls here, you have controls here. So the input controls, the examples of input controls, let me erase this with the hand. The example of input controls are, we have KFC VSL. we have key verification. You have to enter your inputs twice, just like our passwords. When making passwords, in order to make an account for some website or social media, you're required to input your password, right, twice, so that it is sure that the password that you are intending to be your password is actually the password that you have entered. You follow? That's key verification. The next is field checks, wherein it is focused on the number of spaces, the number of characters. So those are field checks. Like for example, on the ID or telephone number. So on the ID, there are only 6 digits. Of course, if you're going to enter the seventh digit, the field check will trigger and it will say it's not allowed, it's wrong because it should only be 6 digits. Okay? And we have control totals. In which on the control totals, it could be a financial total. Like for example, you are processing for salaries of the organization and that the normal salary, we have the standard, the salaries of all the employees is about 1 million. And then you have entered in the system, uh, Mr. A to Mr. X, about 100,000 only. So this 100,000, which is totaled by the control totals internal control, will now be compared to the standard of 1 million. And it will trigger that this might be wrong because usually the total should be 1 million. Okay? And we have validity checks. So validity checks, for example, if you are required to enter your gender, so there should be male, female, LGBTQ plus, something like that. And what you have entered is your civil status, which is single. Of course, this will trigger because the valid is only male, female, and LGBTQ plus. Okay? So that's validity check. And sometimes we have self-checking digits that were used so that the inputted data is the input, right? So if the data is prone to transposition, like for example, again, you have ID numbers 101566, something like that, and then 56565. So this is prone to transposition, right? And for example, you have a self-checking digit that were used, for example, in the 6 digit, no, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In the 6 digit, it shall be multiplied with 5. And if it will result to uh, add numbers, like 25, 35, something like that. So it could be 7, but it couldn't be 8 because it was programmed to be like that. The ID number should have a self-checking digits that when multiplied will result to 25, 35, something like that. So if that's the case, 6 times 5 will become 30. And of course, the system will reject it because supposedly the answer should be 25, 35, 45, something like that. That's the self-checking digit when you add a certain checking digit. Okay? And that if that checking digit will change because you have transposed this 6 and 5, because supposedly this should be 656 and you have encoded 665, for example. So 5, the correct one is 5 times 5, 25. It will have this result. So the system will accept it. But since you have mistransposed, there is a transposition error here. So 6 times 5 becomes 30. It will be rejected. Something like that. I know you can visualize that. Okay? So that's self-checking digit, and we have limit checks, in which the limit checks is focused on the values. For example, there is an employee you have encoded a salary of 1 million pesos. That is impossible because there are no people in the organization who has that salary, monthly salary. So the system will be triggered because of the limit check controls that you have infused the system. So you can put all this in order to ensure that the inputs are correct. Okay? You can use all of this. Sometimes, aside from this, you can also input cryptography, wherein if the input is confidential, you wanted it to be not to be lost, not to be taken by the wrong people. Then, instead of saying, for example, I love you, you can say 143. That's one of the cryptography. Changing the message, the actual message to something that you can only understand, although everybody understands 143. However, that is the what do we call this? The illustration on how cryptography works. Okay? So, the ones that will understand that is the source of the message and of course the intended user of the message. If others will take the message, they will not understand because it has been recoded to not an understandable manner for him. Okay, because he don't have the uh, decoding equipment or decoding formula. Okay, so that's it for input controls. How about processing controls? Of course, if the application or the system has a proper general control, so meaning each stage of development, you are testing it. So systems development and documentation controls, right? And if there are wrongs, you check it immediately before applying it, before implementing the system. Then there will be no problem with the processing controls. However, there are sometimes that there are processing controls that results in an error. Okay? So, you could go back to here. Maybe the inputs are not right, and maybe the formulas of the processing is not right. You follow? So there is a control group always that sees to it that the processing of the system is correct. Okay? Do you get me? Now, let's go to output controls. So on the output controls, you just have to, again, test for the reasonableness of the output versus the input. If this is the input, what should be the output? So you can have the people who knows the the face of the output if ever that is the input. So if you are going to assign them to check the reasonableness of the output, that is already an output control. Okay? And aside from which, those people that you have assigned, aside from they are familiar with what the output looks like if they see the input, you can also assign them to make sure that the output goes to the right hands. So that's an output control. Okay? So that's it for general controls and application controls under information processing, under control activities, which is one of the elements of the internal control. And lastly, so that we will end this particular session, last element of the internal control system that you have to strengthen is monitoring again. You have to monitor all those elements if they're still strong, because if they're still strong, then your internal control is strong. So that's it for this night. Thank you for watching. And the next episode related to this will talk about the transaction cycles. Like for example, the payroll cycle, something like that. So see you on the next video.